Why the system always wins, and you never do. Nietzsche knew it. We often find ourselves standing at the precipice of a profound realization, a whisper in the quiet hours that gnaws at the edges of our consciousness, the gnawing suspicion that despite our best efforts, our deepest desires, and our most fervent struggles, the larger currents of existence, the invisible architectures of power and meaning, seem to hold an unyielding sway. It's the feeling that the game is rigged, not by malice, but by an inherent, systemic design that predates our individual existence and will likely outlast our fleeting presence. We strive, we build, we love, we protest, and yet, the world often appears to reassert its established order with an almost indifferent persistence. Have you ever felt the weary sigh of a dream deferred, not due to personal failing, but because the very ground upon which you stood seemed to shift, recalibrated by forces beyond your immediate grasp? This isn't about simple bad luck or the predictable ebb and flow of fortune. It's about something more fundamental, an underlying structure that shapes our opportunities, our perceptions, and ultimately, our outcomes. It's about the subtle, yet pervasive, ways in which the systems we inhabit, be they social, political, economic, or even psychological, can feel less like tools we wield and more like molds that shape us, often against our will. We celebrate individual triumphs, lionize the underdog who breaks through, and yet, the pervasive feeling remains. The system, in its vast, impersonal complexity, often seems to absorb these exceptions, reabsorbing them into its own narrative, leaving the underlying structure largely intact. This script is an invitation to explore that feeling, to give voice to that persistent, almost melancholic, intuition. It's an exploration of why, so often, it feels as though the system wins. And crucially, it's an attempt to understand what this means when we consider the profound insights of a philosopher who grappled intensely with the nature of power, truth, and the human condition, Friedrich Nietzsche. He understood, perhaps more keenly than most, the pervasive influence of these larger forces. He saw the ways in which our values, our goals, and even our very sense of self are often sculpted by narratives and structures that we inherit, rather than consciously create. This journey is not about succumbing to fatalism, but about understanding the nature of the arena in which we play. It's about recognizing the forces at play, not to be defeated by them, but to perhaps, just perhaps, begin to understand how to navigate them with a clearer, more potent awareness. We will delve into the architecture of this perceived victory, not with resignation, but with a sharpened gaze, seeking to understand the mechanisms of the system, and in doing so, perhaps find a more authentic way to assert our own will within its formidable embrace. The question isn't whether the system wins, but how it wins, and what that revelation might unlock for us. The concept we're unpacking, the pervasive influence of systems, is deeply intertwined with the very fabric of meaning-making, particularly how established narratives sculpt our understanding of what is good, right, or valuable. Think about the subtle yet powerful ways societal norms, deeply ingrained historical accounts, and even the language we use daily, predetermine the boundaries of our thought and action. These aren't static pronouncements, rather, they are dynamic, ever-present forces that shape our desires and aspirations before we even consciously articulate them. Consider, for instance, the concept of success as it's often presented. We are bombarded with images and stories of wealth, fame, and power as the ultimate markers of a life well lived. This isn't necessarily a conspiracy, it's the organic, often unexamined, outcome of a cultural emphasis on certain achievements. Consequently, individuals might find themselves pursuing these externally validated goals, not because they inherently resonate with their deepest selves, but because the prevailing system has elevated them to positions of paramount importance. This creates a kind of psychological inertia, a gravitational pull towards conformity that can make the pursuit of alternative paths feel not just difficult, but almost nonsensical within the established framework. We internalize these values, and then, ironically, we judge ourselves and others based on their adherence to them, perpetuating the cycle. Furthermore, the systems of knowledge and education we engage with often reinforce these dominant narratives. Curricula, historical interpretations, and even the selection of what constitutes important information are all filtered through existing power structures and prevailing ideologies. This can lead to a situation where alternative perspectives or dissenting voices are marginalized or entirely absent, creating an echo chamber that validates the status quo. Consequently, the very tools we use to understand the world, our education, our media, our cultural touchstones, are themselves products of the systems we are trying to critique. This is not to suggest that all established knowledge is inherently flawed, but rather to acknowledge that it is always partial, always filtered, and often, inherently biased towards reinforcing the existing order. Another crucial layer is the way in which systems create and solidify hierarchies. These hierarchies aren't just about economic disparities, they extend to social status, intellectual authority, and even the perceived validity of different life experiences. When certain groups or ideas are consistently positioned at the apex of these hierarchies, their perspectives become the default, the norm against which all others are measured. This can make it incredibly challenging for those outside these dominant positions to have their voices heard or their experiences validated on a broad scale. Think about how often the narrative of progress is told from the perspective of those who benefited most from historical changes, often overlooking or downplaying the suffering or subjugation of others. This selective storytelling is a powerful mechanism by which systems maintain their perceived legitimacy and continuity, ensuring that the established order continues to be seen as the natural, inevitable, and indeed, the best way for things to be. The insidious victory of systems often manifests through the subtle manipulation of our very perception of truth and reality. It's not merely about imposing predefined values, but about shaping the very lens through which we view the world, thereby making the system's dominance appear as an objective, inescapable fact. Consider how scientific inquiry, while striving for objectivity, can still be influenced by funding structures, prevailing paradigms, and the inherent biases of the researchers themselves. When research agendas are dictated by corporate interests or state priorities, the questions asked, the methodologies employed, and the very interpretation of results can subtly, or not so subtly, align with the system's existing power dynamics. This doesn't imply outright fraud, but rather a pervasive, often unconscious, filtering of what is deemed worthy of investigation and how findings are framed. Consequently, the truths that emerge often reinforce the status quo, presenting it as the only rational or evidence-based conclusion. Furthermore, the architecture of public discourse, heavily mediated by corporate-owned media outlets and platform algorithms designed for engagement rather than nuanced understanding, actively curates what information reaches us and how it is presented. This creates an information ecosystem where dissenting or alternative viewpoints struggle to gain traction, often being drowned out by a cacophony of dominant narratives. The sheer volume and repetition of certain messages can lead to their internalization, not through critical assent, but through sheer exposure, rendering them seemingly self-evident. Now, consider how this applies when you witness political debates or news coverage of significant events. Notice how the framing of the issues, the selection of experts, and the emphasis on particular aspects of a story often steer the conversation in a direction that benefits established powers. The system wins by controlling the narrative, by ensuring that even the critiques of the system are articulated within its predefined parameters, thus neutralizing their radical potential. Another crucial layer is the way systems engineer our very sense of possibility. They establish what is considered realistic or achievable, effectively setting the boundaries of our ambition and imagination. This is particularly evident in economic systems, where the narrative of scarcity and competition is so deeply ingrained that alternative models of cooperation and abundance can seem utopian, or even naive. The constant emphasis on individual responsibility for success or failure, while seemingly empowering, can obscure the systemic factors that create unequal starting points and perpetuate cycles of disadvantage. When the system dictates that the only valid path to security or fulfillment is through individual accumulation and upward mobility within its existing framework, it effectively molds our aspirations, making it difficult to envision or pursue radically different ways of organizing our lives and societies. This is the system's quiet triumph, not through overt coercion, but through the subtle, pervasive sculpting of our desires and our understanding of what is possible, making its own perpetuation appear as the only rational, or indeed, the only imaginable, future. The systemic victory, when viewed through a Nietzschean lens, is also profoundly tied to the internalization of a particular kind of morality, one that often prioritizes weakness, mediocrity, and a fear of the exceptional. Nietzsche famously critiqued what he termed slave morality, a system of values that arises from the resentment of the powerless against the powerful. In this framework, traits associated with strength, will, and individual affirmation, such as pride, ambition, and self-overcoming, are reinterpreted as vices, as arrogance, hubris, and cruelty. Conversely, qualities born of suffering and inhibition, like humility, obedience, and compassion for the suffering, are elevated to virtues. The system, by championing this moral code, subtly disincentivizes the very qualities that allow individuals to transcend its limitations. It rewards conformity and discourages the bold assertion of one's own will. When the prevailing societal narrative equates goodness with meekness and conformity, the individual who dares to be different, to pursue their own unique path, or to challenge established norms, risks being labeled as morally deficient, as selfish, or even dangerous. This isn't merely about social disapproval, it's about an internalized moral compass that guides individuals away from the very actions that could lead to their own liberation from systemic constraints. Consequently, even when individuals possess the innate capacity for greatness, or for forging a path outside the prescribed norms, they may be held back by their own conscience, which has been shaped by this pervasive, system-serving morality. Further complicating this is the phenomenon of ressentiment becoming a driving force within the system itself. When individuals or groups feel perpetually disadvantaged or overlooked, their frustration and anger can coalesce into a collective energy that seeks to reshape the system, not necessarily towards genuine improvement or a revaluation of all values, but often towards an inversion of the existing hierarchy, seeking to pull down those perceived as having unjustly benefited. This can lead to a cycle where the system is constantly being reformed, but the underlying dynamics of resentment and power struggle remain, merely shifting their focus. The system, in its adaptability, can even absorb this critique, co-opting the language of liberation while subtly reinforcing its own foundational principles. Think about how revolutionary movements, once they achieve their aims, can often become the new custodians of established power, their initial ideals calcified into dogma, their leaders mirroring the very structures they sought to dismantle. The system wins by demonstrating an almost protean ability to adapt and incorporate dissent, rendering it harmless or even strengthening its own position in the process. It's a subtle but profound victory when the forces seeking to overthrow the system end up, inadvertently, perpetuating its core mechanisms. Moreover, the system's triumph is often secured through the pervasive cult of utility and practicality that it champions. In a world that increasingly values measurable outcomes and tangible results, anything that cannot be easily quantified or that deviates from established functional norms can be dismissed as frivolous, impractical, or even pathological. This is where Nietzsche's critique of the last man, the creature content with shallow pleasures and devoid of higher aspirations, becomes particularly relevant. The system thrives when individuals are discouraged from pursuing goals that are not immediately profitable or socially sanctioned, when the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, the cultivation of artistic expression without market value, or the embrace of existential questioning are seen as unproductive distractions. This utilitarian focus narrows the scope of human potential, channeling energy into activities that reinforce the existing economic and social machinery. It fosters a sense of complacency, where the pursuit of comfort and security within the system's parameters becomes the ultimate aim, eclipsing the more challenging, yet potentially more rewarding, path of self-creation and the forging of new values. The system wins by making its own logic the only logic, its own values the only values, and its own trajectory the only trajectory, thus subtly diminishing the very human capacity for radical evaluation and the creation of meaning beyond its confines. The system's enduring triumph is also intricately linked to its capacity to foster a pervasive sense of existential isolation, even within densely populated environments. This isn't merely about loneliness, it's a deeper alienation stemming from the fragmentation of shared experience and the erosion of genuine communal bonds. As societies become increasingly atomized, individuals are often left to navigate life's fundamental challenges: meaning, purpose, belonging as solitary endeavors. The overarching structures, whether economic or social, often prioritize individualistic competition and self-reliance, subtly discouraging the deep, interdependent relationships that historically provided a bulwark against systemic pressures. Consider how the modern workplace, often demanding long hours and fostering a culture of professional competition, can leave little room for the cultivation of authentic friendships or the development of robust community ties. One might be surrounded by colleagues, yet feel profoundly alone in their struggles, their triumphs, and their deepest questions. Furthermore, the prevailing narratives disseminated through mass media and popular culture frequently reinforce the sense of isolation by presenting idealized, often unattainable, versions of individual success and happiness. These narratives rarely depict the messy, collaborative, and often vulnerable aspects of human connection that are essential for genuine well-being. Instead, they showcase protagonists who, despite facing immense challenges, ultimately conquer them through sheer individual grit and determination. This subtle conditioning can lead individuals to believe that their struggles are unique, a personal failing rather than a common human experience, thereby inhibiting their willingness to seek or offer support. The system wins by fostering an environment where authentic connection is a luxury rather than a necessity, and where the performance of self-sufficiency becomes a primary means of social validation. Building on this, the system also excels at subtly redirecting any nascent desire for collective action or systemic critique into channels that ultimately reinforce its own stability. When individuals feel a growing dissatisfaction or yearning for change, the system often offers readily available, yet ultimately superficial, outlets for expressing this discontent. Think about the proliferation of online platforms where grievances can be aired, petitions can be signed, and virtual communities can form around shared frustrations. While these can offer a sense of catharsis and temporary solidarity, they often fall short of generating the sustained, organized action necessary to challenge deeply entrenched structures. The system wins by providing a safety valve that allows pressure to dissipate without fundamentally altering the underlying architecture, effectively opting dissent into a spectacle of performance rather than a catalyst for genuine transformation. Conversely, the very mechanisms designed to provide security and order can, paradoxically, breed a profound distrust of authentic selfhood and a fear of genuine vulnerability. When individuals internalize the message that conformity is the safest path, and that deviation from the norm carries significant social or economic risks, they may begin to police their own thoughts and behaviors, censoring any impulse that might challenge the established order. This creates a chilling effect on individual expression and the exploration of alternative values or ways of being. The system, by establishing clear boundaries of acceptable thought and action, encourages a passive acceptance of its dictates, as the potential consequences of genuine self-assertion become too daunting to contemplate. The system's victory here is not one of overt oppression, but of cultivating a self-imposed limitation, a psychological architecture of fear and conformity that ensures its own perpetuation. The system's pervasive victory is further cemented by its ability to manufacture and disseminate an overwhelming surplus of information, a veritable deluge that paradoxically obscures rather than illuminates. In this hyper-connected age, we are constantly inundated with data, opinions, and notifications, creating a cognitive overload that makes discerning truth from falsehood, or signal from noise, an increasingly arduous task. The sheer volume of content, often algorithmically curated to maximize engagement rather than foster understanding, can lead to a state of intellectual paralysis. When faced with a constant barrage of competing claims and perspectives, individuals may retreat into passive consumption, accepting the most readily available or emotionally resonant narratives without rigorous scrutiny. This creates fertile ground for the system to subtly embed its own biases and agendas, cloaked within the guise of ubiquitous information. Consider how, in the realm of public discourse, complex societal issues are often reduced to sound bites or sensationalized headlines. This simplification, driven by the demands of media attention spans and the economic imperative of capturing eyeballs, strips away nuance and critical context. The system wins by conditioning us to accept superficial explanations, thereby preventing deeper engagement with the root causes of problems. When the intricacies of, say, economic inequality or geopolitical conflict are condensed into easily digestible, often emotionally charged, narratives, The opportunity for meaningful public deliberation and the formulation of truly transformative solutions is severely curtailed. The system's victory lies in its ability to make complexity seem overwhelming and, therefore, best left to the experts or the established authorities, who are, by definition, products of the very system in question. Furthermore, the system expertly exploits our innate psychological biases, turning them into powerful mechanisms for its own perpetuation. The confirmation bias, for instance, where we tend to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs, is amplified by the personalized content feeds that dominate our digital interactions. These algorithms, designed to keep us engaged, create echo chambers that reinforce pre-existing worldviews, making individuals less receptive to information that challenges their established paradigms. When the system can feed us precisely what we already believe, it solidifies our adherence to its underlying principles, even if those principles are fundamentally flawed or detrimental. This is powerfully illustrated when we observe how societal anxieties are often channeled and managed. Instead of addressing the systemic roots of widespread discontent, perhaps economic precarity, or a perceived lack of agency, the system might offer readily available scapegoats or emphasize individual behavioral adjustments. The focus shifts from reforming the structures that create insecurity to blaming individuals for their perceived shortcomings, or encouraging them to adopt specific, often minor, lifestyle changes. This diversionary tactic is a masterful stroke of systemic self-preservation. It allows the fundamental architecture of power and resource distribution to remain largely untouched, while providing a sense of action or resolution that placates the populace. The system wins by appearing to respond to concerns, while in reality, it merely redirects the energy of dissent into channels that ultimately reinforce its own continuity. The collective sigh of relief, or the fleeting sense of having done something, masks the ongoing, unaddressed systemic issues. Reflecting on this intricate tapestry of systemic influence, we find ourselves at a pivotal juncture. The journey thus far has illuminated the pervasive, often subtle, ways in which established structures can shape our perceptions, aspirations, and even our very sense of self, often in directions that serve their own perpetuation. It's as if we've been navigating a vast, intricate landscape, its contours subtly defined by forces that operate just beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. These forces, woven into the fabric of our daily lives, have demonstrated a remarkable capacity to absorb, redirect, and ultimately, accommodate even the most fervent attempts at deviation. The cumulative effect of these observations is not one of resignation, but of a sharpened discernment, a clearer apprehension of the currents that shape our individual voyages. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider how these various threads converge, not into a singular, monolithic explanation, but into a complex interplay of influences that subtly, yet powerfully, guide the course of human experience. It's akin to observing how multiple tributaries, each with its own distinct character and flow, ultimately feed into a larger, more formidable river. The insights gained suggest that the system's victory is rarely a brute force imposition. Rather, it is a more sophisticated, organic process of shaping the very ground upon which we stand, influencing the air we breathe, and even whispering the dreams we are encouraged to have. This understanding invites a deeper inquiry into the nature of our own agency within these pervasive architectures. The insights we've explored collectively paint a picture not of an external enemy to be vanquished, but of an intricate, internally consistent logic that governs much of our shared reality. Recognizing this intricate architecture does not necessitate capitulation, but rather, it opens a space for a more nuanced understanding of our own position within it. It is a recognition that the very foundations of our perceived limitations are often constructions, albeit profoundly influential ones, that can be examined, questioned, and perhaps, reimagined. The culmination of this exploration is not an endpoint, but a gateway, beckoning us toward a more profound engagement with the fundamental questions of how we choose to live, and how we choose to define victory, in a world so deeply shaped by these enduring systems. The intricate dance we've observed, the subtle yet persistent triumph of systems, is not a condemnation but an invitation to a deeper kind of seeing. It is the recognition that the currents shaping our lives are often less about external decree, and more about the internalized architectures of value, information, and possibility that we, often unknowingly, inhabit and perpetuate. The system doesn't always win through brute force, it wins by becoming the air we breathe, the very lens through which we perceive reality, making its own logic appear as the only logic, its own trajectory as the only trajectory. This understanding, stark as it may seem, is not an endpoint of despair, but a nascent dawn of potent awareness. It is the moment when the illusion of external control begins to dissipate, revealing the more profound, and perhaps more daunting, truth, that the most significant battles, and the most profound victories, are often waged within a landscape of our own consciousness, within our capacity to question the inherited narratives and to forge our own, however quietly. This journey has not been about seeking an external enemy to vanquish, but about understanding the internal mechanisms that allow systemic influence to take root. It's the realization that the most powerful chains are often forged not from iron, but from ideas, not from decree, but from deeply ingrained assumptions about what is possible, what is valuable, and what constitutes a life well lived. The system's enduring victory lies in its ability to shape these very foundations, to guide our aspirations, and to subtly steer our energies towards reinforcing its own continuity. Yet, within this complex interplay, lies the seat of our own agency. It is in the quiet act of questioning, of discerning the inherited from the chosen, of recognizing the constructed nature of so much that we accept as immutable. This is not a call to arms, but a call to a more profound inner vigilance, a commitment to the subtle but persistent work of self-authorship in a world that often encourages the opposite. The true practice begins now, not in a grand gesture of rebellion, but in the daily, conscious choice to examine the assumptions that guide our actions, to seek out the whispers of alternative possibilities, and to cultivate a critical awareness of the narratives that shape our world. It is in the commitment to living authentically, not in defiance of the system, but in a way that acknowledges its presence while refusing to be wholly defined by it. The system may indeed win many battles, but the profound, enduring victory belongs to the individual who learns to navigate its currents with clarity, who understands the architecture of its influence, and who, with quiet courage, chooses to define their own meaning, their own values, and their own path, thereby becoming not a pawn of the system, but a conscious, self-determining force within it. The echo of Nietzsche's insights resonates not as a prophecy of doom, but as a clarion call to embrace the difficult, yet liberating, task of becoming who we truly are, unburdened by the weight of unexamined inheritance.